The morning they came to change the locks, Ruth Calloway was already awake. She had been awake for most of the night, sitting in the single wingback chair she had dragged close to the window, watching the streetlights blur through November rain on the glass below. At 76 years old, Ruth had learned the particular texture of the hours that arrive just before something irreversible happens. The air feels different, thinner somehow, like the world is holding its breath and waiting to see if you will crumble. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The building manager arrived at 8 in the morning with two men she had never seen before and a locksmith who refused to meet her eyes. They stood in the hallway outside apartment 4C with a folded piece of paper stamped across the top in red ink, a red that felt almost deliberate in its cruelty. The building manager, a young man named Dale who had only worked there for 7 months and clearly wished he were anywhere else on earth, cleared his throat twice before he spoke. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I am so sorry. The new ownership has finalized the conversion to luxury units. Today is the agreed-upon date." Ruth looked at the paper he held out to her. She had already read every version of it. She had read the original eviction notice. She had read the appeal she filed herself at the city housing office, sitting in a plastic chair for 4 hours with a number ticket and a thermos of coffee. She had read the response that denied her appeal because the building had been legally sold and the conversion was zoned and approved and entirely within the rights of the new corporate ownership. She had read all of it. She simply had not quite believed any of it until this exact moment. She had lived in apartment 4C for 31 years. She and her husband George had moved in the spring of 1993, when the elm trees on the block were still young enough to let the afternoon light through in long, warm columns. George had carried every box himself, refusing help even though his back had been unreliable for years. He had carried them up 3 flights of stairs and set them down in the middle of the empty living room and looked around at the peeling wallpaper and the radiator that knocked through the night like an impatient house guest. And he had said, "Ruth, I think we are going to be very happy here." And they had been. For 18 years, they had been genuinely, quietly, unspectacularly happy. The kind of happiness that does not announce itself. The kind that lives in the details. Coffee at the kitchen table before the city woke up. The particular way the afternoon light crossed the living room floor in October, orange and unhurried. The sound of George's workshop radio bleeding through the wall of the second bedroom, where he had set up his tools and spent his evenings repairing things for people in the neighborhood who could not afford to replace them. George Calloway had died on a Wednesday in February of 2011, of a heart attack so swift and final that Ruth had not had time to hold his hand before it was over. He was 68 years old. He had been in the middle of repairing a neighbor's antique mantel clock when his heart simply stopped, and the clock had stopped too, as though even the mechanism understood that time, at least for the two of them, had changed its nature irrevocably. Ruth had stayed in apartment 4C after George died, because leaving felt like a betrayal she was not prepared to commit. His tools were still in the second bedroom. His radio was still on the shelf. The small dent in the kitchen wall where he had miscalculated a cabinet hinge in 1997 was still there, and Ruth had never once considered spackling it over, because that small imperfect dent was more George than any photograph she owned. She had stayed for 13 more years after his death. She had paid her rent without fail, never once late, drawing from the modest Social Security income and the small savings account she and George had built together with the particular discipline of people who had never had the luxury of being careless with money. She had watched the neighborhood change around her. The old pharmacy became a juice bar. The hardware store became a co-working space. The grocery where she had shopped for 3 decades was replaced by a restaurant where a plate of pasta cost more than her monthly utility bill. She had watched all of it and told herself that the apartment was still hers, that the 31 years she had spent inside those walls meant something permanent, and that whatever happened to the block outside, her home was not something that could simply be taken away. She had been wrong about that. The building sold in March of that year to a real estate investment company based in another state. The letter informing tenants of the sale arrived in a white envelope that looked so ordinary Ruth almost did not open it. When she did, the language was dense and legal and carefully designed to make the most devastating information difficult to locate quickly. She found it eventually on the 3rd page. All existing residential leases would be honored through their current terms. Since Ruth had been on a month-to-month arrangement for the past several years, her current term ended in 60 days. She had called her son Marcus the same evening. Marcus was 51 years old and lived 40 minutes away in the suburbs with his wife Diane and their 2 teenage boys, in a life that had drifted far enough from Ruth's that their conversations had become quarterly phone calls and one annual Christmas dinner that always ended slightly earlier than it should. "Mom," Marcus had said when she explained what the letter contained, "that is a real problem. I am really sorry to hear that." She had waited for the next sentence, the one where he said she could come to stay with them while she figured out her situation. The guest room. Just temporarily. Just while she found something else. She had waited, and Marcus had said nothing more for a long moment. And then he had said, "Have you looked into senior housing? There are some good programs." Diane's aunt went into one of those, and she said it was actually very nice. Ruth had said she would look into it. She had not looked into it that evening. She had sat in George's old wingback chair for a long time, looking at the dent in the kitchen wall, and thought about what it means when your own son's first response to your emergency is a referral. She called Marcus again in April, and in May. The conversation shifted slightly each time, acquiring a careful quality, as though Marcus were choosing his words from a list of things that sounded supportive without actually requiring anything of him. They explored options together in the sense that Marcus sent her links to websites she had already visited. He mentioned, once, that Diane had concerns about the boys' schedules and the disruption of having someone extra in the house right now, and the phrase "someone extra" landed in Ruth's chest and stayed there like a stone. She spent the final weeks before the eviction date in a kind of deliberate, methodical grief. She sorted through 31 years of accumulated life and made the decisions that a person makes when the space they are allotted for their remaining possessions is suddenly and brutally reduced. She gave George's tools to a young man in the building who was learning carpentry. She gave most of her books to the branch library 6 blocks away, carrying them in 3 trips in a rolling cart. She gave her good dishes to a young couple on the 2nd floor who had just moved in together and owned nothing but enthusiasm and a second-hand sofa. She kept the photographs. She kept her winter coat and her good shoes and 3 changes of practical clothing. She kept the worn quilt her mother had made, each square cut from something that had once been worn and loved. She kept the small radio that had been George's, because she could not explain why, but it felt like the one object in the apartment that still carried the specific frequency of him. And then, at the back of the closet shelf, behind a box of letters and a winter hat she no longer wore, she found the toolbox. It was George's oldest one, a small metal case, fire engine red, scuffed to a soft rust at every corner. He had owned it since before they met, before they married, before any of the life they had built together had begun. Ruth had not opened it in years. She had always assumed it was empty, or near to it. George had moved his actual tools to the 2nd bedroom years ago, and this old red case had sat in the closet like a retired soldier, respected but no longer called upon. She opened it on the floor of the empty bedroom. Inside were 3 things. A small folded square of cloth that turned out, when she unfolded it, to be a handkerchief she did not recognize, white with a faded blue border. A brass key, old and unassuming, the kind that belonged to a padlock or a strongbox, its surface darkened with decades of quiet waiting. And beneath both of those, folded into a small, tight square, and sealed at the edge with a strip of clear tape that had yellowed and curled at the corners, a single piece of paper. Ruth sat on the bare floor of the bedroom that had once been George's workshop and looked at these 3 objects for a long time without touching any of them further. The radio was playing something low and wordless in the kitchen behind her. Outside the window, the city went about its ordinary evening with complete indifference to what was happening on the floor of apartment 4C. She picked up the folded paper last. She peeled the old tape carefully, not wanting to tear anything, and opened the square slowly, the way you open something that has been waiting patiently for a very long time. It was George's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere. The particular slope of his letters, the way his capital R leaned slightly forward as though in a hurry, the way his periods were small and decisive. She had not seen his handwriting in 13 years, and the sight of it now, in this emptied room, on this last night, broke something in her so quietly that she did not even realize it was happening until she felt the tear on her cheek. "Ruth," the note began, "if you are reading this, Then something has happened that I was afraid might happen and could not find a way to say out loud while I was still there to say it. I was never as good with spoken words as you always were. You know that about me. I was always better with things I could work on with my hands. But I want you to know that I thought about this carefully for a long time, and I thought about you, and I want you to be all right. The key in this box belongs to a padlock on a gate at the bottom of Calder Street, near the old rail freight overpass. Go down the stairs behind the gate. Follow the passage to the end. What you find there is yours, and it always has been. I made sure of that. The deed is inside. There is more I want to say, Ruth, but I was never good at saying it, and some things are better left in what they are rather than what we can describe. You were always the best part of everything I tried to build. The note was signed simply, George. Ruth sat on the floor of the empty bedroom for a long time. She read the note twice more. She looked at the key. Then she folded the note back along its original creases and placed it in the pocket of her cardigan, close to her chest, and she held the key in her palm and felt the particular weight of something that has been waiting to be used. The next morning, she loaded the last of her boxes into the hatchback she had driven for 11 years and handed her key to Dale, the building manager, who thanked her with the formal, pained politeness of someone executing an order he has not been allowed to question. She drove 3 blocks and sat in the parking lot of a church that allowed overnight parking for people in difficult situations. She had arranged to stay in the church's fellowship hall for a short period while she determined what came next. The pastor was a kind woman named Reverend Osei who had not asked Ruth a single intrusive question, only handed her a spare set of keys and shown her where the bathroom was. Ruth spent the first night in the fellowship hall in a sleeping bag on a cot, with her 3 bags stacked neatly against the wall and George's old radio on the floor beside her. She did not sleep easily. The fellowship hall smelled of candle wax and folded cloth, and the radiator ran hot, and somewhere in the walls something small and persistent scratched and resettled every few hours. She had called Marcus to tell him she had moved out. He had said, "Good. That must be a relief to have it done." She had said yes. She had not told him about the note or the key, and she was not entirely sure why. Perhaps because whatever George had left for her felt like something private and complete, something that did not belong in the same conversation as Diane's scheduling concerns and the boys' disrupted routines. She waited 3 days before she went to Calder Street. She needed those 3 days. She needed them to sleep and eat and let the rawness of the eviction settle into something she could carry without it spilling over. She was 76 years old, and she had learned, across the long years, that rushing toward an unknown thing before you are steady on your feet is a way of meeting it at a disadvantage, and she had spent enough of her life at a disadvantage already. On the 4th morning, she rose before the sun was fully up, dressed in her warmest layers, put George's note and the brass key in her coat pocket, and drove the hatchback across the city toward Calder Street. Calder Street was in the oldest part of the city, the part that the development money had not yet reached and might never reach. A neighborhood of warehouses converted to things that were not quite thriving and not quite failing. Of fire escapes painted over so many times the original iron was buried under decades of municipal gray. Of sidewalks that buckled and heaved and had been heaving for so long that people simply walked around them without noticing anymore. The freight overpass George had mentioned was easy to find. It was a massive structure of riveted iron, dating from the early part of the last century, the kind of infrastructure built to last forever and now simply enduring, its purpose reduced, but its bones unbroken. Ruth parked on the gravel shoulder at the base of the overpass. She sat for a moment with the engine off. The city was quiet at this hour. The particular quiet of very early morning, when the night shift has gone home and the day shift has not yet arrived, when even the pigeons seem uncertain about their intentions. She got out of the car. The stairs George had described were there, set back into the hillside beneath the overpass, almost invisible unless you knew to look. They were iron, bolted into the concrete retaining wall, the kind of industrial staircase that exists not to be beautiful, but simply to function. They descended sharply into a space that was clearly below street level, below the rail infrastructure above. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy iron gate blocked the passage beyond. The gate was padlocked with a lock so old its surface had gone a deep, uniform amber. Ruth stood at the top of those stairs and looked down, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, not certainty, something quieter than either of those. The feeling of standing at the exact edge of a thing that matters, before the thing itself has revealed what it is. She took the brass key from her pocket and descended the stairs slowly, holding the iron railing with her free hand, feeling the cold radiate up from the passage below, the particular cold of underground spaces where the temperature is constant and ancient and indifferent to the season above. At the bottom, she stood in front of the padlock. She inserted the key. It turned without resistance, as though it had been waiting for this with patience rather than reluctance, as though the mechanism remembered the hand that had last touched it and was simply glad the waiting was over. The gate swung inward. Beyond it, a passage extended into the darkness. The walls were tiled in white ceramic, the kind of tile that lines old transit stations, each square about the size of a playing card, fitted together with the precision of another era. Ruth could see only perhaps 20 feet ahead in the ambient light from the stairway behind her. Beyond those 20 feet was a darkness that was total and very still. She stood at the threshold of the passage for a moment. Behind her, the city, the eviction notice and the son who sent website links and the fellowship hall cot and the 31 years folded into 3 bags. Ahead, darkness and tile and whatever George Calloway had meant by yours, and it always has been. Ruth Calloway took the small flashlight from her coat pocket, the one she had thought to bring because she had been thinking practically about what might be needed since the morning she read the note, and she clicked it on, and she stepped through the gate into the passage, and she pulled the gate closed behind her with a sound like a quiet decision made in private. The tile was cold under the beam of her flashlight, old and cold, and covered in a fine layer of dust that lay undisturbed in a way that told her no one had been through here in a very long time. Her footsteps were soft on the concrete floor, and the sound they made was absorbed immediately by the walls and the low ceiling, the passage doing what all underground things do, keeping what enters inside it. She walked forward, following the curve of the passage, and after perhaps 2 minutes of walking, the passage widened suddenly, dramatically, and Ruth Calloway stopped and lifted her flashlight and let out a breath that was almost not a sound at all, almost just the shape of astonishment escaping from her lungs. She was standing at the entrance to a subway station. Not a ruin, not rubble. A station, intact, sealed from the world above, preserved in the amber of abandonment. The platform extended to her left and right in both directions, easily 100 feet long. The vaulted ceiling arched above her at least 20 feet overhead, its plasterwork intact, elaborate and deliberate. The work of craftsmen who believed the people passing through deserved something beautiful overhead. The platform floor was hexagonal terracotta tile, dark green and cream, laid in a pattern that repeated in every direction with the mathematical certainty of something designed to last. Iron benches still stood at intervals along the platform edge, their wooden slats dark with age but unbroken. Ornate iron columns ran the length of the platform, each one supporting the vault above, each one detailed at the capital with a cast pattern that Ruth's flashlight caught and held for a moment before moving on. The station had a name. She could see it on the curved wall tiles, spelled out in the original station lettering, each letter set individually in cream tile against the dark green field, Calder Street. The letters were intact. All of them. 60, 70, perhaps 80 years of sealed, pressured silence had not disturbed a single one. Ruth walked slowly onto the platform. Her footsteps now echoed, a sound she had not expected, full and resonant, the sound of a space that had been holding its breath for decades and was now, very quietly, beginning to exhale. She moved her flashlight across the space. Down the platform were objects she had not yet made sense of in the first overwhelming sweep of the light. A wooden workbench against the far wall, its surface clear and clean, its legs solid. Shelving units along the back wall with objects on them she could not yet identify in the distance. And at the center of the platform, where a ticket booth might once have stood, a small wooden table, and on the table, weighted by what looked like a smooth river stone, a white envelope. Ruth walked toward the table. Her chest felt very full and very quiet at the same time, the way it had felt on the morning of her wedding, the way it had felt the night George told her he loved her for the first time, standing in a parking lot outside a restaurant they could barely afford, the way it had felt at the moments in her life when something irrevocable was about to become permanent. She picked up the envelope. Her name was written on the front in George's handwriting. Ruth. Just that. One word that had been her entire name inside their marriage. The name he used when he meant her most specifically, when he wanted her to know that out of all the people in the world to whom he might have been speaking, he was speaking to her. She held the envelope and did not open it yet. She looked around the station. The vault above, the tile below, the iron benches and the ornate columns and the letters on the wall spelling Calder Street in the dark. She had been evicted at 76 years old. She had been offered website links and scheduling concerns. She had slept on a cot in a fellowship hall and woken before dawn and driven to the oldest part of the city and descended iron stairs and walked through a gate and followed a passage and arrived here. Here. She had no way of knowing yet what the deed inside this envelope would tell her. She had no way of knowing yet what George had done, or how, or when, or why he had not told her while he was alive to sit beside her in the telling of it. She had no way of knowing what those shelves along the back wall contained, or what the workbench meant, or how long this station had been sealed and silent and waiting. She only knew, standing on the green and cream tile of a forgotten subway platform in a city that had evicted her without ceremony, that George Calloway had known this day might come, and he had not left her with nothing. He had left her with Calder Street. She sat down on the nearest iron bench. The wood of the slat was cold through her coat, but solid, remarkably solid. She sat and she held the envelope, and she listened to the silence of the station around her, which was not an empty silence, but a full one, the kind of silence that has been inhabited by intention and time and the particular love of a person who thinks in terms of what lasts. Outside, somewhere 60 feet above, the city was beginning its morning. The day's shift arriving. The coffee shops opening. The commuter trains running on tracks that were not these tracks, through stations that were not this station, carrying people toward their ordinary days. Ruth sat in the quiet of Calder Street and prepared to open the envelope and read what George had left for her. And for the first time in 4 months, she was not afraid of what came next. The envelope was sealed with the kind of careful, deliberate pressure that tells you the person who closed it took a moment before doing so. Ruth slid her thumbnail beneath the flap and opened it. Slowly, the way you open something you understand you will only open once. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a letter, 3 pages written on the same lined yellow notepad paper George had always kept on his workshop shelf, the kind he used to sketch out measurements and jot down part numbers before he drove to the hardware store. His handwriting filled every line, smaller and more concentrated than the note in the toolbox, as though he had understood that what he needed to say was too large for the space available and had compressed himself accordingly. The second document was folded separately, heavier paper, official-looking, with a raised seal in the upper corner that Ruth could feel with her fingertip before she had even looked at it fully. She read the letter first. Ruth, it began. I want to explain this properly, because I have had years to figure out what I would say, and I still am not sure I have the right words, only the honest ones. In 1987, 3 years after we moved to the city, I found this station by accident. I was doing a job for the transit authority, just maintenance work on the overpass above, and I went looking for a water shutoff in a utility corridor and found the gate at the bottom of the stairs. I do not know why I had a set of bolt cutters in the truck that day. I almost never did. But I did that day, and I cut the old lock, and I went through, and I found this. I know what you were thinking. You were thinking I should have told you immediately. I know that. I want you to know that I thought about telling you every single day for the first year. But by the time I understood what I had found, I also understood that telling you would complicate things in ways I was not equipped to navigate out loud. So I did what I do with most complicated things. I worked on it quietly until I had something finished to show. Ruth stopped reading and looked up from the letter at the vault above her. The plasterwork was extraordinary up close, now that she was sitting still long enough to look at it properly. Not the rough work of a transit authority under deadline, but the careful, intricate work of craftsmen who had been told this ceiling would be seen by thousands of people every day and had taken that responsibility to heart. Garlands of acanthus leaves, repeated in low relief, circling the crown of the vault. Small medallions at regular intervals. All of it still intact. All of it still here. She looked back at the letter. The station was decommissioned in 1951, George had written. It was part of the original freight transit line, not the passenger system, which is why it never appeared on any of the maps people know about. When the freight line was rerouted in 1950, the city sealed this station and, as near as I can tell from the records I found over the years, simply forgot to do anything further with it. No sale, no demolition order, no repurposing. It sat here, sealed, in a category of municipal property so obscure that nobody had flagged it for decades. I spent 4 years researching the ownership. I went to the city clerk's office more times than I can count. I filed applications I barely understood and had to have a lawyer friend of mine. You remember Dominic Farah from the old neighborhood? Read over everything twice. In 1991, after a process so long and bureaucratic I will spare you the details, I was granted a quiet title to this property under the adverse possession and unclaimed municipal land statutes. The deed is yours now, Ruth. It has been in your name since the day I had it drawn up, because I always knew this was not mine to keep. It was mine to find and to clean and to prepare, and then it was yours to decide what to do with. Ruth read that paragraph twice. She read the phrase "in your name since the day I had it drawn up" and felt something shift in her chest, a slow, tectonic movement, the kind that does not make noise but changes the landscape permanently. She kept reading. I have used this space for the last 30 years as my workshop. You know, I always ran out of room in the second bedroom. What you did not know is that I had been bringing my most significant projects here, the ones that needed real time and real space. The shelves along the back wall have inventory I have been building since 1992. Restored pieces, mostly. Furniture, clocks, ceramics, ironwork. Some of it I acquired from estate sales for almost nothing and restored here. Some of it came from clients who could not pay me and offered objects instead, and I accepted because I could see what those objects were beneath what time and neglect had made them. I kept records of everything. The ledger is on the workbench. Every piece catalogued, its condition when I received it, what I did, and what I believe it is worth now. I am not going to tell you the total because I want you to sit down first, and I know you, Ruth, and you will not have sat down before reading this far. So please sit down. Ruth realized she was already sitting on the iron bench and felt, despite everything, a brief and complicated smile cross her face. She sat down further into the bench, squarely, as though honoring the instruction retroactively. I had the collection appraised privately in 2008, 3 years before I died, though of course I did not know it would be 3 years. The appraiser estimated the total value of the catalog pieces at between $380,000 and $450,000, depending on the market at time of sale. That was 2008. I have reason to believe several of the pieces have appreciated significantly since then. The appraiser's report is in the folder on the second shelf from the top, the green one. Additionally, the station building itself and the land parcel attached to it, which runs approximately 60 feet in either direction from the platform boundaries, are the subject of a standing development inquiry I was approached about in 2009. A Heritage Preservation Trust contacted me through my attorney. They were interested in acquiring the station as a cultural landmark. I did not sell then because I was not ready to let it go, but the offer was $1, $2 million, and the trust has continued to grow since then. The contact information for the trust's representative is in the ledger. Ruth stopped reading. She looked at the dark vault above her, and the white tile walls, and the iron columns with their careful cast detailing, and the terracotta floor in green and cream hexagons. And she said nothing because there was nothing to say that would be adequate to the moment. She thought of Marcus saying, "Have you looked into senior housing?" She thought of Diane's scheduling concerns. She thought of the cot in the fellowship hall, and the folded sleeping bag and the 3 bags against the wall. She thought of Dale, the building manager, and his folded piece of paper with its red stamp. She thought of 31 years of rent paid on time. She thought of George carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs on an unreliable back, saying, "Ruth, I think we are going to be very happy here." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed slowly through her nose until the wave passed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Then she kept reading. The final page of the letter was shorter. The handwriting was slightly different, the letters a little looser, as though written at a different time than the pages before it, perhaps later, perhaps when George had been more tired or more emotional or both. I want to tell you something I was not good at telling you while I was alive, Ruth. I was not a man who found feelings easy to carry in plain sight. You knew that. You were patient with it for our whole marriage, and I was grateful in ways I could never say properly. But I want to say it now, even improperly, even inadequately. You were the reason I kept this place beautiful. Every time I came here, every weekend I told you I was working on a job across town, I was here. I was here because this was the place where I could think about what mattered, and what mattered was always you. I put your photograph on the workbench in 1993, and it has been there every day since. The photograph is still there. I want you to see it. I cannot fix the part where I was not honest with you. I cannot fix the weekends where you thought I was somewhere I was not, and I know that will sit strangely with you, and I am sorry for it. But I want you to understand that the secret was not what it might look like. There was no other life, Ruth. There was only this, the quiet work of making something safe for you, in the only way I knew how to do it, with my hands, over time, without words. The station is yours. The collection is yours. Do whatever makes you glad. The letter was signed the same way the note in the toolbox had been signed. George. Just that. His name written the way he said most things, plainly, without ornament, with the full weight of meaning carried in the simplicity itself. Ruth sat on the iron bench for a long time. The flashlight in her hand had dimmed slightly, and she realized the batteries were weakening and she would need to be careful. But she did not feel the urgency of it. She felt instead the particular stillness that comes after a long and difficult thing has finally been set down. Not happiness, not relief exactly, something older than both of those. The feeling of being seen, completely, by someone who is no longer present to be thanked for it. Eventually she stood. She walked the length of the platform slowly, the way she had walked through the empty rooms of apartment 4C on her final morning, but with none of the same hollowness. This was not a walk through a place being left. This was a walk through a place being entered for the first time. She found the light switches behind the station agent's booth at the center of the platform. She did not expect them to work. She flipped the first one and nothing happened. She flipped the second and the platform flooded with light, warm and golden, from a series of industrial fixtures George had clearly installed along the ceiling at some point over the years, running on a power source Ruth did not yet understand. The light changed everything. Under the flashlight, the station had been mysterious. Under this warm, amber light, it was magnificent. The shelves along the back wall ran from one end of the platform to the other, floor to ceiling, fitted carefully between the structural columns. They were full, not chaotically, not haphazardly, but with the deliberate organization of a person who kept careful inventory of what he owned and why. Ruth walked toward them slowly. The first section held clocks. Dozens of them. Mantel clocks, bracket clocks, wall regulators, carriage clocks, each one resting on a padded base, each one with a small hand-lettered card in front of it that Ruth recognized as George's catalog system. She leaned in close to read the nearest one. American Insonia Mantel Clock, circa 1880. Rosewood case. Movement fully restored, July 1998. She pressed the tip of her finger gently to the clock's case. The wood was smooth and deep and warm even in this cold air, the kind of warmth that comes from oil and time and patient hands. She walked further. There were sections of ceramics, pieces wrapped in cloth and nested in padded crates with their catalog cards tucked into the front. A section of framed works, stacked carefully face out, each separated by acid-free board. Several complete sets of antique tools, arranged in fitted wooden cases. A section of ironwork, drawer pulls and hinges and fireplace implements in small, decorative pieces, each polished to a finish that had survived decades without tarnishing. And at the far end of the shelving, a section that took Ruth a moment to understand what she was looking at. It was furniture, small pieces, the size of which could be managed by one person with a dolly and careful planning. A side table with inlaid work so fine Ruth had to lean in close before she could see that it was composed of individual pieces of differently colored wood fitted together without gaps. A blanket chest with carved panels on every face, the carving depicting a continuous scene of a forest in different seasons. A writing desk with a fall-front lid and a fitted interior of tiny drawers and cubbyholes, each of a slightly different wood, a maker's exhibition of skill contained in a form no larger than a suitcase. Ruth stood in front of the writing desk for a very long time. She had never known George to produce work like this. He repaired things. He fixed things. He was practical and precise and enormously skilled in the way of a man who has spent his life understanding how objects are put together and what they require to continue functioning. But this was not repair. This was creation. This was the work of a man who, after the paying work was finished and the practical problems were solved, sat down in a sealed and silent station and made something purely because he could, purely because the making of it was its own justification. She found the workbench. It ran along the wall behind the agent's booth, clear and clean and organized in the way George had always organized a workspace. His tools hung on a pegboard above it in the silhouettes he had drawn in marker years ago, so he always knew what was missing and where it should return. His reference books were on a small shelf at the end of the bench. His magnifying glass was on a stand near the right side. And there, exactly where he had said it would be, was the photograph. It was a snapshot from their vacation in 1996, the one week they had taken in upstate New York at a borrowed cabin. Ruth was standing on a dock over a lake, in a yellow raincoat because it had rained every single day of that trip, and she was laughing at something just off camera, her head tipped back, her hand raised, mid-gesture in whatever story she had been telling. She had never seen this photograph. George must have taken it without her noticing, which meant he had been watching her laugh and had thought, I want to keep this. The photograph had been in a small frame on George's workbench for 27 years. Ruth picked it up. She held it carefully. She looked at herself at 49 years old in a yellow raincoat on a dock in the rain, laughing, not knowing she was being watched, not knowing that the person watching her was also the person quietly building her a sanctuary 30 feet underground in a city that would one day try to put her out in the cold. She set the photograph down carefully, facing her, and she went to the green folder on the second shelf from the top. The appraiser's report from 2008 was thorough and specific, and Ruth read it standing at the shelf because she did not trust her legs to carry her to the bench and still hold the folder. The total estimated value of the catalogued collection at 2008 prices was $412,000. The appraiser had flagged 6 pieces as exceptionally significant, including 3 of the clocks, the inlaid side table, and 2 of the ceramic pieces, which he had identified as the work of a regional studio potter of considerable historical importance whose work had been undervalued for decades and was beginning to attract serious collector attention. The ledger on the workbench was meticulous. 30 years of entries in George's handwriting. Every piece, its provenance as best he could determine it, its condition on arrival, the work done, the date completed, the appraised or estimated value, and a column at the right-hand edge labeled simply Ruth. Ruth noticed, as she turned the pages, that this column was checked for every single entry, every piece, as though he had asked himself, for each one, whether it was ready to be something that belonged to her, and had answered yes, every time, and marked it accordingly. She set the ledger down open on the bench. She looked at the length of the platform and the vaulted ceiling and the lights George had installed that still burned warm and steadily. She looked at the clocks on their padded bases and the ceramics in their crates and the furniture that bore the marks of his hands and his patience and his entirely private ambition to make something beautiful in a place where no one would see it until she did. The air in the station was cool and very still. Somewhere, she could hear the faint vibration of the city above, the trains on the active lines, the traffic, the ordinary machinery of 10,000 lives being lived simultaneously at ground level. Down here, none of that urgency penetrated. Down here, it was simply quiet and warm from the lights and full of things that had been made and kept and catalogued and labeled Ruth. She thought about what she was going to do next and was surprised to find that she already knew. She was not going to call Marcus. Not yet. Not today. Today was not a day for anyone else's voice or anyone else's calculations about what this meant and what it was worth and what should be done with it. Today was a day to walk slowly through every inch of this space and let it become real. Let it move from the abstract of a letter read on an iron bench to the specific and tactile reality of walls and floors and objects that had been touched by George's hands for 30 years. She walked back to the agent's booth and looked at the mechanism George had used to power the lights, a heavy-duty generator setup connected to an external power line whose source she traced along the wall to a utility conduit. He had arranged a proper electrical connection. Then, at some point in the last 3 decades, he had solved that problem too, quietly, without making it a story. She opened the agent's booth door and stepped inside. It was small but not cramped. George had fitted a shelf along one wall with a handful of personal items. A thermos that still had the residue of coffee dried along its interior lip. a folded wool blanket on the shelf below, a small battery-powered radio of the same brand as the one he had kept in their apartment, the one she was now carrying in her bag. She looked at the radio and thought about how many Saturday afternoons she had heard it playing low through the wall of the second bedroom, and had thought he was in there repairing something when in fact he was here, in this station, with his own music and his own work and his private, deliberate love for her taking shape on the shelves. She did not feel betrayed by the deception. She had sat with that possibility carefully during the 3 days before she came here and had arrived at an understanding of it that she thought was honest. George had kept this place secret not to exclude her, but to protect the thing he was building for her. He knew, as she knew, that a gift given too early is not a gift. It is a burden. If he had told her about the station in 1991, or 1997, or 2003, it would have become a worry, a thing to be maintained and insured and decided about, a complication in a life that already had enough complication. He had sheltered it from all of that until it was finished, until she needed it, until it was ready to receive her. She stood in the small agent's booth with the folded wool blanket and the thermos and the radio and the knowledge that her husband had spent 30 years in this underground room building her a future, and she thought of how thoroughly she had misunderstood what he was doing with his time. She thought of all the small and ordinary evenings she had spent in the apartment while he was here, and she felt not loss, but something more complicated and more generous than loss. She felt loved. Loved in the way that only very private and very patient people love, without announcement, without credit, over decades, in a sealed space below the surface of an ordinary life. She picked up the wool blanket and carried it out to the iron bench. She sat down and wrapped it around her shoulders and sat in the warm light of the station George had made, with the terracotta tile floor and the vaulted plaster ceiling and the shelves full of beautiful things and the photograph of herself in a yellow raincoat facing her from the workbench. She sat there for a long time, and she did not feel lost. For the first time in months, in the cold underground quiet of Calder Street, Ruth Calloway did not feel lost at all. The following morning she came back. She brought coffee in her own thermos and a small bag with a flashlight and spare batteries, though she did not end up needing the flashlight because the generator power held steady. She spent the morning going through the ledger page by page and cross-referencing each entry with the piece on the shelf, confirming that the catalog was intact, that nothing was missing, that everything George had recorded was still exactly where he had said it was. It all was. In the afternoon, she found the contact information for the Heritage Preservation Trust in the green folder alongside the appraisal report. The trust was called the Weston Civic Heritage Foundation, and the representative George had corresponded with was a man named Arthur Demko. There was a phone number and a business address and a photocopy of the offer letter from 2009, which had been written on the foundation's letterhead and was signed by Mr. Demko in a firm, clear hand. Ruth read the letter. The foundation's interest was in acquiring the station as a landmark and restoring it for public use as a heritage site and community gathering space. The offer of $1.2 million had been contingent on a full structural assessment, which the foundation had commissioned at their own expense, and the results of which were also in the folder. The assessment had found the station to be in excellent structural condition. The plasterwork was sound. The tile was largely intact. The foundation and bearing walls showed no significant deterioration. The station had been assessed as fully restorable to active use at a cost the foundation had estimated they could absorb within their existing capital program. Ruth set the letter down and looked around the station and thought about what it would mean for this space to be open to people. She thought about people walking across the terracotta tile and looking up at the plasterwork vault and sitting on the iron benches. She thought about it being lit properly, from above, the way it had been intended to be lit when it was built. She thought about the name on the wall, Calder Street, visible to people passing through, not just to one woman sitting alone with a flashlight and a dead man's letter. She was not ready to make any decisions. She knew that. There were legal questions she would need to answer and practical questions and financial ones, and she would need to find a lawyer who was not Dominic Farah, who had died in 2014, and she would need to have the collection properly reappraised at current values. And she would need to understand exactly what owning this property entailed in terms of taxes and liability and all the other burdens that come with ownership of something real. But those were tomorrow's problems, or next week's, or next month's. Today she sat at the workbench on the stool George had kept there, and she looked at the photograph of herself in the yellow raincoat, and she opened his ledger to the first entry dated July 3rd, 1992, and she read every page from the beginning, slowly. The way you read something when you understand that reading it is itself a form of companionship, and that the person who wrote it would be glad to know the words were finally being received. The lawyer's name was Patricia Osei, and she was the younger sister of Reverend Osei at the church where Ruth had been sleeping on a cot. Ruth found out about her by accident, the way most useful things are found, by mentioning her situation to the wrong person in the right way. She had been helping stack chairs after a Wednesday evening service when the Reverend asked, quietly and without pressure, how things were going with the property situation. Ruth had said, more honestly than she intended, that she needed a lawyer she could trust and did not know where to begin finding one. Reverend Osei had smiled and said, as it happens. Patricia Osei was 44 years old, precise, and had the particular manner of a person who had heard many complicated stories and was not easily surprised by any of them. She met Ruth at the station on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after Ruth had first opened the gate. Ruth led her down the stairs and through the passage and through the gate. And when the platform lights came on and Patricia Osei saw what she was standing in, she stopped walking and was quiet for a full 10 seconds, which Ruth had already come to understand was a significant pause for a woman of her temperament. "This is extraordinary," Patricia said. Her voice was level, but her eyes were moving across the vault and the tile and the shelves with the careful attention of someone cataloging what she was seeing in real time. "Your husband acquired this through quiet title?" Ruth handed her the deed and the folder of documentation George had kept in the filing cabinet behind the agent's booth. Patricia sat on the iron bench and read through everything with the methodical patience of a person for whom thoroughness is not a virtue, but simply a baseline. She asked 3 questions during this process, each one precise and answerable, and Ruth answered them. When Patricia finished, she closed the folder and set it on her knee. "The deed is valid," she said. "The quiet title process your husband used was legally sound for the period in which it was filed, and I see no grounds for challenge. The property is yours, Mrs. Calloway. The station, the land parcel, and everything in it." Ruth had known this. George's letter had told her so. But hearing it stated plainly by another person, a professional person with no emotional stake in the matter, settled something in her chest that had still been uncertain despite everything. She exhaled slowly. "As for the collection," Patricia continued, "you will need a current appraisal before you make any decisions about sale or insurance. The 2008 report is useful as a baseline, but the market for this category of antique has shifted considerably in 16 years, and several of the flag pieces may have appreciated substantially. I can recommend an appraiser who specializes in estate and heritage collections." She paused. "What about the foundation's offer?" Ruth looked down the platform at the name on the wall. Calder Street. She had been thinking about the foundation's offer for 2 weeks, turning it the way you turn a thing in the light to see what it shows from different angles. "I want to meet with them," Ruth said, "before I decide anything. I want to understand what they intend to do with it." "That is exactly the right instinct," Patricia said. They sat together in the warm light of the platform for a few minutes before climbing back out to the street. Ruth noticed, as they walked, that Patricia ran her hand along the wall tile as they passed through the entrance corridor. A small and almost unconscious gesture, the kind a person makes when they are touching something they recognize as significant and do not want to pass without acknowledging it. The appraiser Patricia recommended was a man named Vincent Haas, who arrived on a Tuesday with 2 assistants and spent 6 hours in the station going through every piece in the collection with a thoroughness that made Ruth feel she had been doing it correctly herself. He consulted references on his laptop, made calls from the platform in a low voice, photographed everything from multiple angles, and took detailed notes that he shared with his assistants in a running, quiet commentary Ruth could not quite follow but trusted. At the end of the 6 hours, Vincent Haas sat across from Ruth at the workbench and opened his preliminary notes. "I will give you the full written report within 10 days, he said. "But you should know the broad picture now. The 2008 appraisal significantly undervalued 3 of the ceramic pieces. The studio potter your husband acquired them from, a woman named Clara Voss who worked in this region from the 1940s through the 1970s, has been the subject of a major retrospective at 2 significant institutions in the past decade. Her work has been re-evaluated considerably. The 3 Voss pieces alone," he paused, and Ruth noticed he chose his next words carefully, as though he understood that numbers of a certain size require a moment of preparation, are currently valued in the range of $180,000 to $220,000 collectively. Ruth was quiet. The inlaid side table, he continued, is the work of a craftsman named Edmund Pruitt, who worked in this region in the 1930s. There are 12 documented Pruitt pieces in institutional collections. This would be the 13th. Its value to the right collector or institution would be difficult to overstate. I would estimate $90,000 to $120,000, conservatively. The mantel clocks are uniformly excellent. The furniture your husband made himself, and here he paused again, is of a quality that I did not expect to find in this context, and I mean no disrespect by that. Several of these pieces are museum quality, the writing desk in particular. He set his notes down and looked at Ruth directly. The total collection value, he said, at current market, is somewhere between $780,000 and $940,000. The upper end of that range assumes strong market conditions at time of sale and the right placement of the vase pieces and the Pruitt table. The lower end is a conservative floor in poor conditions. Either number is, I think, significantly more than you may have anticipated. Ruth said nothing for a moment. She looked at the photograph of herself in the yellow raincoat. She looked at the first page of George's ledger, which she had left open on the workbench at his first entry from July of 1992. A mantel clock, condition poor, movement ceased. Acquired from Mrs. Edna Pearson, Lot 14, estate sale, $12. George Calloway had paid $12 for a broken clock in 1992 and spent the hours of 30 years turning $12 in patience and skill into nearly $1 million, and he had labeled every page of the ledger with her name. "Thank you," Ruth said. Her voice was very steady. "Thank you for your time." After Vincent Haas and his assistants left, Ruth sat alone on the iron bench in the platform light and let herself feel the full weight of what was happening without trying to manage it or reduce it or make it sensible. She had been evicted from her home 2 months ago. She had been sent a list of senior housing websites by her son. She had slept on a cot in a fellowship hall and driven across the city before dawn to follow a dead man's instructions to a locked gate at the bottom of a staircase beneath a freight overpass. And here she was. She thought about George. She thought about the particular quality of his love, which had never been verbal or demonstrative, which had expressed itself in repair and maintenance and making things work. In the replaced window latch she came home to one evening without having asked for it. In the way he had always made sure her car was serviced without being reminded. In the 30 years of Saturday afternoons he had spent underground building her a safety net she had not known she needed. She thought about how insufficient the word love is for what some people do, how the word describes a feeling when what it should sometimes describe is a practice, a discipline, a sustained and patient act performed over decades in the absence of witness or recognition. She had been married to a man whose love was the size of a vaulted underground station, and she had not known it until she was 76 years old and had nothing left to lose. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and stood up and went to find out what could be done about the generator connection, because the practical problems were still the practical problems regardless of what else was true. It was Reverend Osei's husband, a retired electrician named Bernard, who sorted out the generator situation. He came on a Saturday morning and spent 3 hours tracing George's original wiring and declared it sound but aging, recommending a new connection through the utility corridor that would be cleaner and more reliable. He charged Ruth nothing, and when she insisted, he accepted a cup of coffee from her thermos and a long look around the platform that left him shaking his head slowly in the way of a man confronted with something he did not have language for. By the end of the 3rd week, Ruth had established a routine. She came to the station every morning with her thermos and spent the first hour simply sitting with the ledger and the collection, letting the familiarity deepen. Then she worked. She had begun the process of properly documenting everything herself, cross-referencing George's ledger entries with photographs she took on her phone, building a parallel record that would be useful when the time came for decisions about what to sell and what to keep and what to offer to institutions that might house it better than a sealed platform could. The work was absorbing and precise and suited her in ways she had not expected. She had always been organized. She had always been good with detail. 40 years of managing a household and attending to the needs of a man who did not communicate his requirements verbally had made her expert at reading context and inferring necessity and keeping track of things that mattered. Those same skills applied, she was discovering, to the cataloging of a significant private collection in an underground transit station. The forms were entirely different. The underlying capability was the same. She moved out of the fellowship hall at the end of the third week. Reverend Osei had mentioned, without pressure, a small furnished apartment available through a church contact, a ground floor unit 3 blocks away, affordable on the income from George's modest life insurance policy that had paid out in 2011 and which Ruth had kept carefully preserved against emergency. The apartment was small and plain and had a kitchen window that faced a brick wall, and Ruth thought it was perfectly adequate because adequacy was not the point. The station was the point. The apartment was simply where she slept. She called Marcus on a Sunday evening, 5 weeks after she had first opened the gate on Calder Street. She had rehearsed the conversation and then set the rehearsal aside, because rehearsed conversations tend to perform authenticity rather than achieve it. Marcus answered on the third ring. His voice had the slightly guarded quality it had acquired over the last several months, the quality of a person who has not behaved well and is aware of it without being prepared to say so. "Mom, how are you doing? Are you settled somewhere?" "I am," Ruth said. "I'm settled. I have some news I wanted to share with you in person. Would you and Diane be able to come into the city next Saturday?" There was a pause. "Diane and I have the boys' tournament that afternoon," Marcus said. "We could probably come in the morning, maybe 11? 11 is fine," Ruth said. "I'll send you the address." She did not tell him what the address was. She sent only the street number and the cross street. She did not mention the overpass or the gate or the stairs. Marcus and Diane arrived at 11:15 on a bright December morning, parking on the gravel shoulder where Ruth's hatchback sat. Ruth was waiting at the top of the stairs. She watched their car from a distance for a moment before they saw her. Diane was speaking and Marcus was nodding in the way he did when he was listening but not quite present, and Ruth felt the familiar compressed patience that had characterized most of her interactions with her son's marriage. She walked toward them. They greeted her with the careful warmth of people managing their own discomfort. Diane hugged her briefly and said she looked well. Marcus looked at the freight overpass above them and the gravel shoulder and the iron stairway leading down and said, "Mom, what is this?" "Come down and I'll show you," Ruth said. She led them down the stairs. She unlocked the gate with the brass key and held it open for them and pulled it closed behind. She walked the passage ahead of them, and she heard Diane say quietly to Marcus, "Where is she taking us?" And she heard Marcus reply, "I honestly have no idea." At the end of the passage, Ruth reached around the corner of the station entrance and turned on the platform lights. She stepped back and let them walk out onto the platform ahead of her. Diane stopped so abruptly that Marcus nearly walked into her. He stopped too. They stood at the platform edge and looked up at the vaulted ceiling and down at the terracotta tile, and along the length of the shelves, and across the iron columns and the benches, and the name on the wall. Calder Street. Neither of them said anything for a full, long moment. "What is this place?" Marcus said finally. His voice was different than it had been at street level. Quieter. "It belongs to me," Ruth said. "It has belonged to me since 1991. Your father found it and acquired it and spent 30 years restoring the collection on those shelves, and he left it to me." Marcus turned slowly to look at her. His face was doing something complicated that Ruth watched without trying to interpret. "Dad knew about this. Your father built this," Ruth said. "Every piece on those shelves was acquired, restored, or made by him. The ledger on the workbench has every entry he made from 1992 to 2009, when his hands started to give him trouble with the fine work." Diane had walked forward along the platform and was standing in front of the shelving, looking at the clocks on their padded bases, the ceramics in their crates, the framed works stacked face out with their catalog cards. Her expression was unreadable. Marcus walked to the workbench. He looked at the pegboard of tools and the reference books, and the ledger opened to the first page. He looked at the photograph of Ruth in the yellow raincoat. He stood in front of it for a moment. "I've never seen this picture," he said. "He took it in a place he never told anyone about," Ruth said. Marcus picked up the ledger and turned a few pages. He read in silence for a moment, and Ruth watched him register the columns, the descriptions, the dates, the careful notations in his father's handwriting. He turned more pages. He stopped at an entry from 2004, a bracket clock, mahogany case, which George had noted as the most technically demanding restoration he had attempted and which he had labeled in the Ruth column with a small asterisk and the note, especially. Marcus stared at that asterisk for a long moment. "What is it worth?" he asked. His voice was level. Ruth had always given Marcus credit for this, that he was not theatrical about the things he felt. But she could hear what was underneath the level tone, and she chose her words accordingly. "The collection has been appraised at between $780,000 and $940,000 at current market," she said. "The station itself and the land parcel attached to it are the subject of an offer from a Heritage Preservation Foundation of $1.2 million. I have not yet decided whether to accept that offer or pursue alternatives." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the air in a room. Diane had turned from the shelves and was looking at Ruth with an expression that had moved through several things quickly and arrived somewhere Ruth recognized. It was the expression of a person recalculating who they were standing in front of, and what that person represented, and what the social geography of the relationship now looked like from the new coordinates of what had just been disclosed. Ruth had seen that expression before. She had seen it on the faces of people at Greenwich dinner parties the first time Arthur's stepchildren learned that Evelyn had managed the entire estate's financial ledgers herself for 15 years. She had seen it in various forms at various moments across her adult life. The particular recalibration that occurs when someone who was filed under one category is suddenly revealed to belong in another. She was familiar with it. She was not moved by it. "Marcus," Ruth said. She waited until he looked up from the ledger. "I want to say something to you that I have been thinking about for several weeks. And I want you to hear it without responding immediately, because I am not saying it to wound you, and I do not want it to land that way." He nodded. "When I told you I was being evicted," she said, "you sent me links to senior housing websites. When I called you a second time and a third time, you spoke about Diane's scheduling concerns and the boys' disruption. I spent 4 months sleeping on a cot in a church fellowship hall before I found this place. And in those 4 months, you called me twice to ask how I was doing, and both times the call lasted less than 10 minutes. Marcus opened his mouth. "I am not finished," Ruth said, not unkindly. "I am telling you this not because I want an apology, though I would not refuse a sincere one. I am telling you because I need you to understand something. I found my way here without your help. Your father made sure I would have something to find, and I had the presence of mind to follow the instructions he left me, and here I am. I do not need rescuing. I did not need rescuing then, though I would have welcomed steadiness and basic presence, which are different things." She let that sit for a moment. "What I am offering you," she said, "is the truth. I am your mother, and I love you, and I intend to remain in your life and in the lives of your boys. But I am not going to pretend that the last 4 months were acceptable, because they were not. And I think we will have a better relationship going forward if we agree not to pretend about that." The platform was very quiet. Somewhere above them, the city turned at its ordinary pace. Down here, the lights burned warm and steady. Marcus set the ledger down on the workbench very carefully. He looked at the photograph of his mother in the yellow raincoat. He looked at the 30 years of entries in his father's handwriting. He looked at the tools on the pegboard and the reference books on the shelf and the small thermos sitting at the corner of the bench that was Ruth's, not George's, that she had placed there last week and that had made the workbench feel, for the first time, genuinely hers. He turned to face her. His face had moved through the complicated thing and arrived somewhere plainer and less defended, and Ruth recognized in it, at some depth, the residue of the person he had been at 10 years old before his father's reserve had taught him to suppress what he felt until it simply stopped surfacing. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. It was inadequate, and he seemed to know it was inadequate, but it was genuine, and Ruth, who had spent 40 years distinguishing between the genuine and the performed in the people around her, recognized the difference. "I know," she said. "Let's start from here." Diane said very little during this exchange, and Ruth did not require her to. There would be other conversations. There would be time to establish what the relationship could be between them now that the coordinates had been reset. Ruth was not interested in forcing warmth or manufacturing connection. She was interested only in what was honest and what was possible, and she was willing to find out how much of that remained. She showed them the collection that morning, walking them slowly along the shelves the way she had walked them herself that first day, reading the catalog cards, letting the objects speak their particular language of patience and time and skilled hands. She showed them the 3 vase ceramics and the Pruitt table and the writing desk George had made himself, with its fitted interior of differently toned woods. She showed them the clocks. Marcus stopped in front of a small carriage clock in a brass case and read the catalog card, and Ruth saw his jaw tighten briefly in the particular way it had tightened since he was a boy when something moved him and he was not going to say so. He had inherited that from George. She had always known it and had always felt tenderness toward it. He was here every weekend for 30 years, Marcus said quietly. It was not quite a question. Most of them, Ruth said. He told me he was working jobs across town. Marcus absorbed this. He reached out and touched the brass case of the carriage clock very lightly with one finger, the same gesture Patricia O'Shea had made with the tile wall, the gesture of touching something to confirm its reality. He never said a word, Marcus said. No, Ruth agreed. He was your father. They left at 1 o'clock. Marcus hugged her at the top of the stairs, a longer hug than usual, the kind that is trying to cover ground that words have not managed. Diane said, quietly, that she hoped they could have dinner soon, and Ruth said that she would like that, and she believed she meant it, or was at least willing to find out if she did. She watched the car pull away and stood for a moment in the December air. The city made its sounds above her. She could smell snow in the atmosphere, the particular mineral cold that arrives before weather rather than with it. She looked at the entrance to the stairs and thought about what was below them, the gate and the passage and the platform and the vault and the lights and the name on the wall. She went back down. In January, Ruth met with Arthur Demko of the Weston Civic Heritage Foundation in the station itself, because she felt it was important that the conversation happen in the space rather than in an office, and because she had discovered that she had become, over the past weeks, somewhat protective of the station's dignity and did not want it represented by a conference room and a PowerPoint presentation when it could simply be itself. Arthur Demko was a man in his mid-50s with a quiet authority and the kind of professional appreciation for historic spaces that manifests as extended, reverent silence upon entering one. He was silent for almost a full minute after he walked onto the platform. Then he turned to Ruth and said, "This is one of the finest intact transit interiors I have seen outside of an institutional collection." Ruth said, "I know." They talked for 3 hours. She had prepared for the meeting with Patricia's help, and she came with specific requirements that she laid out clearly and without apology. The Foundation's acquisition offer was a starting point for a negotiation, not an endpoint. She wanted the station preserved and open to the public, but she had conditions. She wanted a permanent acknowledgement of George Calloway's stewardship of the space during the decades of its abandonment, a plaque or an installation or some form of record that documented what he had done here and what it had meant. She wanted a portion of the upper platform level, if renovation permitted, designated as a community space for local programming with preference given to arts education. And she wanted first right of refusal on any future sale or repurposing, in perpetuity, so that whatever the station became in its next chapter, it could not be converted to a use that contradicted what George had intended. Arthur Demko listened to all of this with the attention of a man who recognized that the person across from him had done her thinking carefully and was not interested in negotiating against herself. The figure, he said carefully, would need to reflect the conditions. "I would expect it to," Ruth said. They arrived, after 3 hours, at an agreement in principle. The final number was not $1. $2 million. The final number, accounting for the conditions Ruth had attached, was $1. $55 million, and Arthur Demko shook her hand with the expression of a man who had not entirely anticipated how this conversation would go, but was glad for how it had. Patricia reviewed the terms and said they were sound. The collection sold separately, over the following year, piece by piece, to collectors and institutions that Patricia and Vincent Haas identified through their respective networks. The 3 vase ceramics went to a regional museum that had been seeking her work for its permanent collection and paid $210,000 for all 3. The Pruitt table went to a private collector in the Midwest for $105,000. The writing desk, George's own work, went to an institution whose acquisitions director spent 40 minutes examining the joinery before agreeing to the price, which was $85,000, and who said, before leaving, that he wished he knew who had made it so that the piece could be properly attributed. His name was George Calloway, Ruth said. He was a repairman who lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. The acquisitions director wrote it down. Ruth watched him do it and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as the specific satisfaction of a person being accurately named. By the following spring, Ruth Calloway was not sleeping on a cot. She was not 3 bags against a wall. She was in the ground-floor apartment with the kitchen window that faced a brick wall, which she had come to find she did not mind at all, because the light in the morning came in at an angle that crossed the kitchen table in a long, warm column, and she took her coffee there every day before she went to wherever the day required her to be. She had given a portion of the proceeds to the church, specifically to the fund Reverend Osei maintained for emergency housing assistance, because Ruth understood now, in her bones rather than in the abstract, what it costs a person to need that kind of help and not know where it will come from. She had set aside a fund for each of Marcus's boys, to be held in trust until they were 25. She had not announced this to Marcus. She had simply had Patricia draw up the documents and had told Marcus matter-of-factly that it was done. He had been quiet for a long moment on the phone and then said, "Mom, you didn't have to do that." She had said, "I know. That's why it's worth doing." The plaque was installed in the station on a Wednesday in March. On the wall beside the agent's booth, a rectangle of polished bronze with raised letters. George Calloway, it read. 1943 to 2011. He found this place, kept it, and made it beautiful. The rest of what he did in private. Ruth had written the words herself. Patricia had asked if she wanted something more formal, something that documented the legal history of the acquisition or the scope of the collection or the years of stewardship. Ruth had said no. She had said that the things worth knowing about George were not the things that fit into a formal account. On the day the plaque was installed, Ruth stood in front of it for a long time. The platform was still closed to the public, still in the early stages of the foundation's restoration, but the bones of it were unchanged. The vault above, the tile below, the iron benches and the columns, and the name on the wall. Calder Street. Around her, contractors and preservation specialists moved through the space with the careful professionalism of people who understood what they were working with, and Ruth watched them and felt nothing proprietary in it. Only the satisfaction of seeing the station begin to become what it had always been capable of being. She was 76 years old. She had been evicted with 3 bags and a brass key and a note in George's handwriting that said, "Go down the stairs and follow the passage to the end." She had followed the passage to the end. She walked out of the station on a morning in March when the air was beginning to carry the first actual warmth of the approaching season, the kind of warmth that is only detectable if you have been paying attention to cold for long enough. She walked up the iron stairs and stood on the gravel shoulder beside the freight overpass and looked at the city around her, which was exactly what it had always been, ordinary and indifferent, and full of people moving through their days without knowing what was beneath their feet. She thought about what it means to be seen by someone who is no longer there to see you. She thought about 30 years of Saturday afternoons and a thermos of coffee and a yellow raincoat photograph and a ledger with her name in the right-hand column of every single page. She thought about the bench and the platform and the wool blanket and the first morning she had sat there and felt, for the first time in months, not afraid. The city went about its business above the station. The trains ran on their active lines. Somewhere a few blocks away, a child was laughing at something in the particular unguarded way that children laugh when they have not yet learned to monitor their own joy. Ruth listened to it for a moment and then walked toward her car, into the warming March morning, into the day that was hers to use however made her glad. She had been told, in various ways and by various people across the last several months, that she had nothing. She had learned, in a sealed station below a freight overpass on Calder Street, that nothing is sometimes just a door you have not yet opened. She opened it. She walked through. She came home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.